Hello, CalCIMA. Glad to be here with all of you for this virtual spring thaw. My name is Rob Mutri. I am a policy advocate and attorney for the California Chamber of Commerce, and I handle CalOSHA. So I'm here to speak to you on CalOSHA and what's coming in 2021, what to keep an eye out for. And I'm recording this on October 30th, so I'm not sure when you'll see it, but let me just say early or late, happy Halloween. So what's coming up at CalOSHA in 2021? We're going to go through all the pieces with asterisks here, but we're going to touch on the wildfire smoke regulation, which many of you may remember from last year when it came into effect in 2019. There's going to be an important date in 2021 there, as that is transitioned from a emergency reg to a permanent reg, and that will allow an opportunity for feedback from the stakeholder community. Also, we have a new COVID-19 emergency regulation in November. This is the really hot topic. That was not an intentional pun about wildfires. You'll have to excuse me. This is the hot topic that's going to really have a huge effect across just about every workplace in the state, and will go into effect probably by the end of 2020. So that's really timely to hear about. There's a number of other regulations also in the pipe with CalOSHA in various stages of the rulemaking process, but they are not emergency regulations and they may not move as quickly. COVID has occupied a lot of the division in CalOSHA's resources, so it's not clear how quickly these will go or if they'll move in 2021. We will at least touch on the indoor heat illness, as this is something that's more important to indoor manufacturing, and also may have a vote in 2021, especially likely late 2021. Other standards that are in the process, revised lead standards, been waiting on a vote for some time with the standards board. Hydrogen-powered forklifts, elevator rules also moving through, but we're not going to touch on them today. Background information on CalOSHA. Many of you will know this, but for my speech to make sense, I just need to put some background in here. CalOSHA Standards Board is the voting body which approves standards and also votes to bring forward a potential standard for a later approval, right? So essentially they approve an action and then that gets them to the vote where now the new standard comes before them and they vote on it. The division, this is the enforcement and research branch. They prepare and draft the text of most regulations, though not all, and they handle enforcement. So you're going to hear those two groups discussed in this talk. What is the regulatory process? In a normal world, this is a very simplified version. Believe me that there's a list of steps at that link, which is much lengthier and much more complicated. But for our purposes, the regulatory process begins when the standard board votes to grant a petition for rulemaking, or the standards board can take action on their own. And that begins the process of drafting a regulation and talking to stakeholders. Then that regulation comes before the board votes on it. That regulation then goes to the Office of Administrative Law if it's approved, which reviews it to make sure it meets certain legal guidelines for regulations, and then it goes into effect. Normally that's at least 30 days after the vote. As we'll hear, that's not true with emergency regulations. Emergency regulations, let's talk about these. So this process is important because as we talk about the COVID-19 regulation, you need to understand it. The simple top-down version is emergency regulations allow for less stakeholder input. They are published before the meeting, a shorter period, so only 5-day requirement before the standard board votes do they need to be published, and they go into effect sooner after the standards board votes on them. After the standards board votes, they go to OAL, who generally has about 10 days there, and then you could see the standard in effect 10 days or so after the standards board votes. So you're looking at a big picture, a much shorter window from first daylight to in effect for emergency rulemaking. The other important thing to know is that emergency rules expire. You cannot govern perpetually on an emergency basis. They're in effect for 180 days by default, and then they can be extended with 2 90-day extensions. At that point, after 360 days or 1 year-ish, there must be a new passage of a permanent regulation by the standards board. And that's important because that's an opportunity for stakeholders like yourselves to weigh in and speak to the standards board and say, hey, the text of what you did before doesn't work for us. Can we change this? Can we tweak this? You won't usually see large changes, but you'll see some important tweaks or potential there. emergency wildfire smoke. Why is this so important right now? Obviously, California had an unprecedented wildfire season. Um, this regulation, as to your businesses, right, isn't about how you put out those fires, but it's about what you have to do for your workers. Hopefully you all are already aware and already doing this because the emergency regulation, again, has been in effect since 2019. But you have to monitor the AQI at your work sites. You have to provide training and information, and you have to stockpile N95s and hand them out. And that's the most important one I want to emphasize here because, as you know, N95s are hard to get right now, borderline impossible to get at a reasonable price if you are not in healthcare. So that regulation, though it's in effect, has some real blatant feasibility problems in the present time. Again, that's going to matter in a second. As I said, it's already in effect. Oh, excuse me. Talking about that 1 year time period. It was adopted in July of 2019, extended twice. Technically, it should have expired in July of 2020 without a permanent regulation. However, one of the governor's executive orders about COVID-19 pushed back regulatory deadlines to give time for the fact that stakeholders might not be able to put in input during a COVID-19 crisis when they might be shut down, for example, and that the regulatory agencies are occupied elsewhere. So presently that emergency regulation is still in effect, but you may see it transition to a permanent regulation in 2021. And that's important because that's a chance for you to have some input and to potentially tweak parts of it that aren't feasible. For example, the availability of N95s, if it's still an issue, or the thresholds at which the regulation comes into effect. As some of you may know, presently the regulation comes into effect at an AQI of 150 for PM 2.5 particles, which are the particles associated with smoke. And then the second threshold in the regulation presently is 500. At that 500 threshold, you must have your employees wearing N95s or else they can't work. At the 150 threshold, you have to have them on hand if the employee wants to wear them, but they're not required to. And that's a gross simplification of the regulation, so please don't base your compliance plan on that. But those thresholds could all be changed at the passage in 2021 of the permanent regulation. So that's why it's important to keep this one in mind going into 2021. Here are some websites with some additional information for background you can pull up. DIR's website on the wildfire smoke emergency generally, and some alternative compliance. This is an important note about the availability of N95s. CalOSHA recently put out some guidance on alternative compliance. How can you self-certify a KN95 to fill the role of an N95, things like that. I won't get into the details of these alternative compliance strategies. They are not everything that the business community wanted. I can just daylight that issue, having worked with CalOSHA and complained about this issue and feasibility for some time, but they may be helpful to some employers. So I want to put that information out for you. So COVID-19, why is this regulation so urgent to talk about right now? Let me just say up front, that little question mark icon down there, I will wear my heart on my sleeve, so to speak, about this, that I'm not the most experienced PowerPointer, but the point of that question mark is this COVID-19 regulation we know very little about. We don't know what its text is going to be because, as that second bullet point says, there has been no advisory committee process about this. So let me step back and give you the context. In September, the Standards Board voted to have a COVID-19 regulation drafted so they could vote on it by the November meeting. At that point, the Standards Board also voted to not have an advisory committee process until after the regulation's in effect, which means stakeholders such as business groups, CalChamber, CalCIMA, and everybody else, labor as well, doesn't know what's in that regulation. We will all find out 5 days before the Standing Board votes on it when it's released along with the agenda for that meeting. At that point, there'll be very little chance for us to make any changes to it, right? It's 5 days. Even if we make good points, there's no way the division staff and the Standards Board staff is going to say, oh, good point, let me go back and check with all of the people I need to touch with, right? Which would be CDPH, the governor's office, and others, and then get all those changes worked out and then come back in 5 days. It's not going to happen. So whatever text is revealed 5 days before that meeting is going to be basically going into effect 15 days from then. As I said before, that's 5 days before the meeting it gets released. Standards Board is going to vote yes on it is the extreme likelihood, unless there are some gross errors in it. The Standards Board is going to vote yes on it, which means that you'll have a regulation potentially going into effect 10 days after that meeting that all of us just saw for the first time. Petition 583, that link there will get you to the page on this. That'll give you some background and show you the documents that have kind of been generated in the process, which is the petition that started this process and the initial decision the board approved to move through the process. But the text of the petition, the text of the draft regulation isn't there. So as much as I wish I could give that to you, it is not available, as I said. Now let me pause here and just deal with a separate question. I get asked all the time, if there's no COVID-19 regulation in effect already, why am I hearing about citations on employers? What was all that about citations at Foster Farm and others? Presently, the division is issuing citations under its Injury and Illness Prevention Program authority, and it's enforcing what it's generated, and hopefully you all are familiar with, its, quote, guidance documents, which are industry-specific, multi-page guidance documents on their website. They update them periodically, and they are citable, though they're not proper regulations. There's a link there so you can pull them up. Presumably you're already familiar with them, but employers can be cited on these, and there's a link there to the press releases so you can see some of the citations. Speaking of enforcement, is the division coming for me? Potentially, yeah. These things are enforceable. Like I said, they could come to your site. However, I should flag that the division is very overworked presently, and the enforcement has been centered on the kind of high priority areas: food processing, agriculture, retail, grocers. Those are the kind of the big areas they've been hitting. Penalties have ranged anywhere from $5,000 to above $50,000 for proposed penalties. That's not the ultimate price that is paid. It's not, once they work through the process and settle, that's the initial proposal that's advertised by DAR. But I want to give you a sense of the scale. Okay, so as I said, we don't know much about the text of this regulation. What do we know? Who will it cover? According to the petition, which the board granted, they asked the division to prepare a regulation covering workplaces that were not already under the aerosol transmissible diseases standard. So basically that means if you're not a hospital or other kind of facility covered by the ATD standard, this will cover you. So it's going to have broad effect across the state. And what will it require? Again, we can't be sure, but the National Lawyers Guild attached a draft. Let me back up one step and give the context. The petition 583 that the board voted to approve that started this whole process was submitted by the National Lawyers Guild and a labor group called WorkSafe, which many of you may be familiar with. Along with that petition, they submitted a draft regulation that they would, thought as a model. That model is not binding on the division staff. There's no reason the division staff was required or is required to use it when they're putting together the eventual regulation the standards board will vote on. But given the tight timeline for that regulation, which is the standards board said, give us a regulation to vote on in September, and they will be voting on it in November if it works through the process quickly enough. That's 2 months. The division is unlikely to have started from scratch, which means they probably integrated part of the National Lawyers Guild draft. Now that National Lawyers Guild draft is on the link I showed you 4 slides ago for petition 583. So you can see the text there, but it touches on a lot of pieces. It has and a number of the provisions are pretty prescriptive. Things like you must have 6 foot of distancing at all times, even if you're wearing N95s. And even if there's a glass shield between you, you still have to have 6 feet of distancing. There's issues like that in that text. So that's one of the reasons we're concerned. It also touches training, record keeping, reporting, cleaning, and what PPE you have to provide. And I should note that all of the requirements in that model from the National Lawyers Guild don't take into account the legislation that was passed this year. This petition was submitted to the board early this year, well before everybody knew what legislation was passed, and it was signed by the governor. So it actively contradicts, and in some places just infringes on, but in some places actively contradicts legislation that was passed. So that's another issue and the reason the business community needs to be engaged, because contradictory requirements are never something you want. So what can we do about it? So in the short term, nothing, maybe a bit strong, but not much. As I said, it's going to go before the board in November if they can get through the bureaucratic approvals that quickly. If not, it'll be before them in a special session in late November or at the December meeting, which means that it's going to be in front of them quite quickly. We probably won't see it till a few days before that meeting, and they're unlikely, supremely unlikely, to accept any changes in that time period. That leaves us with whatever regulation is put forward by the division staff when they draft it, and they've been talking to the governor's office and others, but whatever text goes in front of the standards board is going to be voted on and passed, and it will be in effect pretty promptly. Now, so what is our opportunity to really make changes? Well, we will submit comments letter. The CalChamber there will certainly submit comment letters to the standards board when they vote. But our chance for a real change is going to be the 2021, because the standards board, when they approved the petition, provided for that advisory committee process after the fact, after the regulation has been passed. Obviously, that's not ideal. We wish we could do input beforehand and make changes, but that advisory committee process after it's passed is going to be critical because, like I said, it may have contradictory provisions. It may have provisions that were in the model that we don't like, that may be all kinds of issues. So it's going to be critical for all stakeholders, and especially the business community, to step in that advisory committee process clearly and really participate and push the division to make this regulation feasible and consistent with other laws. In the near term, what can you do? As I mentioned, the standards board meetings are on Zoom and by phone, and they're November 19th and December 17th. Those two dates are set. So you can take part. You can call in, you can go on Zoom, there will be public comment, and you can kind of raise your voice about concerns, either about the process and this lack of stakeholder input before the regulation goes into effect, or about potential substantive issues. But that comment is open. The calendar is there. I'm sorry that text didn't hyperlink, but that is the text to get to the calendar if you want to look at the agenda. So turning to the last regulation we're going to cover, the indoor heat regulation. Why haven't you heard about this year? So this regulation dates back. As you may know, California passed the first in the nation outdoor heat regulation in 2013. And the indoor heat regulation, which was meant to be its partner, went through the advisory committee process in 2019. And the division settled on the text that it's going to submit to the board in mid-2019. But the text has been sitting there with the division. I believe it's actually under the SRIA process presently, which SRIA is the Specialized Regulatory Impact Analysis. Basically, it's the economic analysis of potential regulation. We don't know how long it'll take them to do that, and we don't know when it'll come in front of the board. It's the short version. But at some point, I would expect this to likely be late 2021 or mid to late 2021, potentially early 2022, it will come before the board for a vote. And so it would behoove us to kind of be aware of it before then and to keep its provisions in mind if we're talking about workplaces that have manufacturing or restaurants, any hot indoor spaces. So who will it cover? We have the text here. Excuse me, what will it cover? The text is available at that link. As I said, the division has settled on its text, and because it was part of the advisory process, the normal, advisory committee process, they normally publish that text. So this is an example of the division putting out the text and employers and stakeholders being able to be aware of it early. So you can look at that text there and think about how it applies to your workplace right now, because that is the text that will go forward to the standards board. Generally speaking, it starts kicking in when the temperature gets in the 80s. There's some thresholds set at 82 degrees, some at 87 degrees Fahrenheit, but that's the temperature broad strokes, that's the temperature to keep in mind. The regulation is lengthy, so I'm not going to try to summarize it beyond that, but I recommend you take a look and be aware of it because, again, that may come up in 2021 or mid to late or early 2022. So that's the end of the presentation. Thanks for your time. Here's some resources that may be helpful if you are looking for some follow-up. CalChamber puts out a podcast, which I've been commenting on all of these regulations on in the past. That's the Workplace podcast. There's the link there. And we also put out weekly publications on Fridays covering legislative and regulatory issues. And have to include those here. Otherwise, our marketing department will be upset with me. So thank you for your attention. There's my bio link as well as my email and contact information. Feel free to reach out if you have questions, and thank you so much.